So there may be a subset of charter schools out there not included because it didn't have test scores to be included.
I know that it was mentioned in here, the list of states that they did, and there were a couple of cities that were just the cities themselves, but of the states that did, it was the complete statewide testing. And he may be right there, maybe they didn't test most schools, but it was statewide data, all of the schools in there.
And they weren't assuming that it was all the Arkansas students, underneath students that we are, under students from that. Is it really a true measure?
I don't know that offhand. Even in the report, I don't think there's enough details to answer that question. You probably have to actually ask the researchers. Okay, so there's been a couple other things. One study I was involved with, that thought about this differently and said, well, we're focusing a lot on test scores, but are there other outcomes that we want to think about? And so I was part of a study that looked at Chicago and Florida high schools. What was kind of interesting here is we looked at test scores in these two locations, and the test scores weren't much different from the Chicago and Florida charter students than the students in traditional public schools. But what you found in terms of graduating and going on to college was much different. The graduation and college attendance was about 7 to 15% higher in charter schools than traditional public schools. So it's potentially that charter schools aren't making much difference in test scores, but there may be other outcomes that they're making a difference in. And there was another study, an anonymous district that not be revealed, that looked at behavioral outcomes and looked to see if you have more incidents once a student switches into a charter school. Are they having more suspension as a student, getting in trouble less, or so on? They actually found that behavior improved once the student went into a charter school. Now, I think there's a big caveat there that do all schools systematically suspend students for the same things? You can imagine one school might be more lenient than another. And so you're measuring these things based on the student got suspended this many times in a traditional school and then got suspended this many times in charter schools. Maybe the charter schools were just more lenient. But nevertheless, it provides initial insights that say that there might be some improvement in terms of behavior. Okay, next slide. Okay, parental satisfaction, I talked about this earlier, that I think it's difficult to draw strong conclusions here because parents might defend their choice they made to go to a charter school as opposed to a student that's in a traditional public school because of assignment. They were assigned to that school. You need to do things like using random assignment, random samples of parents in both groups and making sure you get responses and so on. Anyway, when there has been study, they have generally shown that there's higher parental satisfaction in the charter schools. Still, I'm not too surprised with that because if you weren't happy with the charter school, you probably just would exit back out because these are schools of choice. Next slide. Okay, so the competition question. So the ways that researchers have dealt with this is one, they've surveyed students or principals and so forth in traditional public schools near charter schools, for instance, and say, have you lost students to a charter school? And if so, have you changed anything about your operation in response to charter schools entering the landscape? And the answer has generally been no. The parent principals basically haven't changed their operation in response to charter schools. Now, you may make the argument that the principals is not the person to ask, rather the district might be the one that making changes. So there is a flaw in that type of design of the study. But there's also been an analysis looking at test scores of traditional public schools. Once a charter school enters the landscape or nearby to a traditional public school, was there improvement in traditional public schools? Most of the research has shown that no, there hasn't been much of an effect. However, in a few locations, Florida and Texas, they've found some positive effects. And then there's some mixed results in Michigan. You can imagine that, one, charter schools aren't representing a large portion of the population, 2 to 3% nationally. So maybe that just isn't enough to create competitive effects. But also, I remember when I was in Los Angeles and talking to the school district there, they had overpopulated schools, and when a charter school came in, they were actually happy because that meant less trailers out there to fill for the surplus of students, and they could have students go into charter schools. So it became a release valve, not a threat of competition. It was a way to deal with the overcrowded schools. So there was really no incentive to have competitive effects there because they were already oversubscribed. One of the things I should note there at the bottom, there's been research in Michigan that shows that charter schools actually draw more students from private schools than traditional public schools. So a charter school goes out where the students come from. About 20% of them came from traditional or charter schools, private schools, I'm sorry. And the rest came from public schools, but private schools represent about only 10%, so they're disproportionately coming from private schools. And that may have certain implications. You have new families in the public domain, and maybe they'll support public education more. Or it could be the opposite, that suddenly you have to pay for these students that were previously in a private school. The state has to pay for the students being in the public domain. So it could have different implications.
Is that only in Michigan?
That's the only study, or the only state that's been examined.
I know in New York and Boston and these other places that would not be accurate.
They have not examined this particular issue. Anecdotally, there's occasionally stories that charter schools are really creating challenges for the Catholic schools in places like Philadelphia, Chicago. They're shutting down a lot of Catholic schools because of charter schools entering the market, and they're taking lots of students from the private schools. So. Okay, so for funding, this is something that proponents of charter schools have argued almost since the inception, that they're not getting their fair share of funding. And there's been a few studies, not a lot, that have examined this issue, and generally, not in all states, but in most states, charter schools are receiving less funding than traditional public schools. Now, there are reasons for this that these studies have noted. One is whether the state provides for facilities or not. Oftentimes, states do not. So they have to take money from their operating expenditure or operating revenue and use it for facilities where the traditional public schools are not. They have a separate budget for that. And then also, many states only allow you to get the state portion of funding and not the local funding. So places like, for instance, Ohio, a large share of the local funding for schools come from local property tax. Charter schools don't get that share, they only get the state funding. Now, it's not all states that do that. Some of them allow them to get both sets of revenue, but that makes a big difference whether you're going to get equal proportion of funding or not. Also, there's whether charter schools have to participate in categorical programs or if they just get a lump sum amount. So, lots of charter schools don't participate in free and reduced lunch, for instance, because they may only have 50 to 60, 100 students, whatever, it's a small charter school. And maybe 20 of them would be free and reduced lunch students. It's a lot of paperwork to fill out for 20 students. And some charter principals just don't do it. They don't think it's worth it. There's other examples of this. In California, you have to apply for lots of categorical funding for different programs, transportation, certain curriculum, and they just don't do it, so they get less funding. It's not necessarily they can't get that funding, it's just they're not doing it. And sometimes it's for a curriculum program that's not consistent with the philosophy of the charter school. They want to do something different. The state's only going to give them funding if they do X, not Y. So that can also lead charter schools to getting less funding.
Is there any research on the types of, was it the bigger or the better performing charter schools coming to a place where there's only state dollars and not local dollars? Have you seen that?
I have not, yeah. So maybe the credo is something worse that you can look at that issue, but I have not seen that. Okay, and then I should make this big caveat here. So generally charter schools are getting less funding, but they have potential to get certain funding that's traditional public schools can